want you to think about your parents for a second. Not what they said about wine, not what they taught you about wine, what they drank. Close your eyes if you want. Picture the kitchen, the counter, the fridge. What was in there? I'll tell you what was in mine. Asti Spumante, that sweet, fizzy Italian sparkler that came in a bottle that looked just vaguely festive. My parents brought it out for celebrations like New Year's or maybe a birthday. It wasn't serious. It wasn't discussed at all, let alone with reverence. Nobody swirled it or talked about the nose. It was the thing that you opened when something good happened. It was cheerful and sweet and completely unpretentious because nobody in my house was pretending to know anything about wine. And then there was Sunday, and Sunday was football. And football was beer. Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors, Milwaukee's Best, Jenny Cream Ale. I can still see those commercials, the Clydesdales and the Swedish bikini team, Spuds McKenzie, the Frogs. Beer owned Sunday the way the NFL owned Sunday. It was the American sports beverage. Nobody cracked a bottle of Burgundy at halftime, and nobody paired their nachos with a Barolo. It was beer, and it was everywhere because beer showed up. Beer invested in television. Beer understood that if you wanted to be part of an American culture, you had to be on the screen during the things that Americans cared about. The Budweiser Clydesdales, they weren't just selling beer, they were making beer feel like a national tradition. And here's what's interesting. There was nothing stopping wine from doing the same thing. There was no law, no regulation. Wine just never showed up. Never made a Super Bowl commercial. Never had a mascot. Never even tried. The industry thought it was above all that. It's too sophisticated for a 30-second spot between the third and fourth quarter. Too serious. Too important. And so an entire generation learned the lesson. Beer was fun. Wine was fancy. Beer, I met you where you were. It's on the couch or at the tailgate in the backyard. And wine, it waited for you to come to it. Wine was nowhere. Wine coolers? Oh God, we had those. We had those in the woods behind my house, in the basement of my friend Aaron's house when his parents were out of town. Long live Bartles and James. But real wine, it wasn't ours. It wasn't cool. It was just there in the background, slightly sweet or vaguely European. Not for us. And here's the thing I've been thinking about. Every single one of us has had a version of that origin story. Wine found us or didn't find us through the people who raised us. And whether we realized it or not, our relationship to wine is shaped as much by what our parents drank as it is by anything we've chosen for ourselves. Because the very first thing every generation does with wine is reject whatever came before it. And I think that rejection, that instinct to rebel against your parents' taste, it isn't just a phase. I think it's kind of an engine of wine culture. It's how wine evolves. It's how new styles emerge and old ones get rediscovered. And understanding that pattern might be the key to understanding why young people are walking away from wine right now and what we can do about it. Let me walk you through the last 70 years of wine in America and watch this pattern repeat itself because it's remarkable how consistent it is. Now, before the 1960s and 1970s, most Americans didn't really drink wine. Well, not seriously. Wine in America was jug wine, Gallo, Paul Mason, whatever came in a big glass bottle with a screw top. It was cheap and it was sweet and it really wasn't something you thought much about. Your grandparents' generation, if they drank wine at all, drank it the way you drink water. It was just on the table. It was unremarkable, and nobody was discussing tannin structure. Now, listen, there's exceptions, of course. There are pockets of wine culture in certain communities and certain families in certain parts of the country. But broadly, wine in mid century America was an afterthought. The real drinks, they were cocktails, martinis, Manhattan, highballs, the Mad Men era. Wine was what your immigrant grandmother drank or what the priest poured at communion. And then the boomers, the discovery generation. The baby boomers, they grew up. They started traveling to Europe, discovered that wine could be extraordinary, and they brought that enthusiasm home. The Judgment of Paris happened in 1976. California wines beat French wines in a blind tasting that shocked the world, and suddenly, American wine had prestige. Napa Valley exploded, wine became aspirational. And then Robert Parker arrived, a lawyer from Maryland, a detail I find personally meaningful, who started rating wines on a 100-point scale, and that changed everything. Parker didn't just review wine. He created a system that told people exactly how good a wine was in a language they already understood. 90 points meant good, 95 meant outstanding, 100 meant legendary. You didn't need to know about terroir or vintage variation or malolactic fermentation. You just needed the number, and the boomers, they loved it. They were discovering wine for the first time. Their parents hadn't handed them a roadmap, and they needed a system. They needed confidence. Parker gave them that. He said, "You don't have to wonder if this bottle is worth $70. I'm telling you it is. Trust the score." The wines that era produced reflected that culture. They were big, bold, extracted, oaky, massive Napa Cabernet, butter bomb Chardonnay, wines designed to score well on Parker's palate because his palate moved markets. Winemakers literally changed how they made wine in order to get these higher scores. The boomers' rejection was clear. They rejected their parents' jug wine, their parents' indifference to quality, their parents' lack of sophistication. They wanted wine to be serious, important, scored, ranked, collectible. They turned wine from a beverage into a status symbol. Gen X, the middle children. Then there was us, the forgotten generation, in every cultural conversation, including this one. We grew up in the shadow of the boomers' wine revolution. By the time we were old enough to drink, the Parker system was already dominant. The Napa cult wines, they were already exploding. Wine had already become serious and important and expensive. We inherited a wine culture we didn't build, and our relationship to it was complicated. We didn't rebel against it the way millennials would. That's not really our style. Gen X doesn't stage revolution. We just side eye things. We're skeptical without being very loud about it. We tried the big Napa Cabs because that's what was in front of us, but a lot of us started quietly looking around the edges. We were the early people who started paying attention to Spain, to the Rhone, to Italy beyond Chianti, to regions and grapes that the boomer mainstream hadn't anointed yet. We didn't get a movement. We didn't get a label. Nobody called it the Gen X wine revolution because that's not how Gen X works. We just kind of found things on our own, quietly, without a manifesto, without TikTok. So for me, wine came through my then father in law. He had a vineyard in rural Maryland. And when I say vineyard, I don't mean the romantic vision of rolling hills, golden light, someone in linen sipping from a crystal glass. I mean frozen fingers picking grapes, mud, hard work, wine as agriculture, not as a lifestyle. That's how it entered my life, not through a tasting menu and not through a score, through dirt and cold hands and a family member who loved something enough to grow it himself. I went through WSET as a lawyer, doing it purely for personal interest. I never had a career aspiration in wine. I didn't have any ambition to become an influencer. I was just curious. I became a serious collector during COVID, which is frankly the most Gen X origin story imaginable. Because we don't discover things through movements, we discover them through quiet obsession. And I think that matters for this particular conversation because Gen X is the proof that you don't need a rebellion to find wine, you don't need a manifesto, you just need an entry point that feels like yours. The millennials, the Counter Reformation. So, the millennials came along and said, we don't want any of this. They looked at the boomers' 100-point wines and they saw pretension, gatekeeping, a wine culture that was expensive, hierarchical, and worst of all, corporate. All those big, polished, high scoring wines started to taste the same to them. Where's the personality? Where's the soul? Where and who is the farmer? And so millennials swung the pendulum. Natural wine, orange wine, skin contact whites, cloudy, funky, weird, alive, pet not. The natural sparkling wine that sometimes explodes when you open it. Wine from places nobody's parents have ever heard of. The Republic of Georgia, the Canary Islands, Jura in eastern France, volcanic soils in Sicily. The weirder, the better. The farther from dad's Napa Cab, the cooler. And the millennial rebellion wasn't just aesthetic, it was moral. They didn't want just different wine, they wanted ethical wine, sustainable, organic, biodynamic, low intervention. They wanted to know who made it, how they farmed, and whether their workers were treated fairly. They brought the same values they applied to food, farm to table, local, transparent, to what was in the glass. The rejection, it was pointed. They rejected their parents' scores, their parents' labels, their parents' brand worship. They wanted wine to feel authentic, personal, theirs. See the pattern? Jug wine gave birth to scored wine. Scored wine was quietly questioned by Gen X and then loudly rejected by millennials in favor of natural wine. Each generation didn't just find new wines to drink, they specifically rejected the wines their parents love and the values those wines represented, and built something new on top of that rubble. Which brings us now to Generation Z. And here's where the pattern breaks, or at least where it looks like it breaks. Because Gen Z isn't rebelling against a particular style of wine, they're rebelling against wine itself. The numbers, they're stark. Only 54% of American adults say they drink alcohol. That's the lowest number Gallup has recorded in its almost 90 years of existence. Gen Z is drinking roughly 20% less than previous generations at the same age. Among Gen Z wine drinkers, only 29% say wine is their primary drink, behind beer and spirits. Wine is losing market share, not to just other alcohol, but to cannabis, to wellness drinks, to nothing at all. And the easy explanation is health. They've heard the message. There is no safe amount of alcohol. Alcohol causes cancer, calories, hangovers. They're the most health conscious generation in memory. So they're opting out. But I actually don't think that's the whole story. I think something deeper is going on. Gen Z came of age during COVID. I talked about this in the loneliness episode, but it's worth revisiting through this lens. Their introduction to alcohol wasn't social, it was watching their parents drink at home, alone, often too much, as a coping mechanism. They didn't sneak a beer at a party, they didn't share a bottle at a college dinner. The social architecture that previous generations associated with drinking, the party, the bar, the dinner table, was taken away from them during the exact years when those rituals normally got established. And then there's the identity piece. Every previous generation had something in wine to rebel against. The boomers, they rejected their parents' indifference. The millennials rejected their parents' scores and corporate brands. But Gen Z, what do they rebel against? Their millennial older siblings already claimed the rebellion. Natural wine, already cool. Orange wine, already done. Weird grapes from obscure regions, Well, that's been the hip thing for a decade. The counterculture position has been occupied. So, what do you do when the rebels are already your older siblings? When the anti establishment is the establishment? Well, you opt out entirely. You don't rebel within wine, you rebel against wine. You say this whole thing, whether it's scored or unscored, conventional or natural, from Napa, from Georgia, it isn't for me. And you reach for an edible, or a Celsius, or a mocktail, or nothing at all. That's not a rejection of wine specifically. It's the same generation instinct that plays out in a totally different way. Every generation needs wine to feel like theirs, and if there's no unclaimed territory within wine, they'll go outside it, unless we give them space to make it theirs. So, what does the wine industry do with this? Because I think we've been getting the response exactly wrong. The industry's instinct has been to chase Gen Z, put wine in cans, make labels edgier, create Instagram friendly branding, reduce alcohol levels, market wellness, to basically say, we see what you want and we're going to reshape ourselves to give it to you. Trust me, I understand that instinct. The economics, they are real. If your customer base is aging out and the next generation isn't showing up, you adapt or you die. But here's the problem: every generation can smell when they're being marketed to. And the harder an industry tries to be cool for a younger audience, the less cool it becomes. Nothing kills authenticity faster than a legacy institution trying to act young. It's your dad doing the Macarena. It's a bank using TikTok slang. It's cringe. What I think we should be doing instead is something much harder and much more honest. We should be making space, not telling Gen Z what wine should be for them, not repackaging our product in their aesthetic, but creating room for them to discover wine on their own terms, at their own pace, through their own experiences, the way every previous generation did. So the boomers, they weren't told to love Napa Cabernet. They traveled to Europe, they tasted something that blew their minds, they came home and found it for themselves. The millennials, they weren't told to love natural wine. They stumbled into a wine bar in Brooklyn and somebody poured them a cloudy Gamay, and they had an experience that felt more authentic than anything that their parents had shown them. I wasn't told to become a collector. I picked grapes in Maryland. I got curious. I found my own path through WSET and some quiet obsession. Discovery, it has to feel like yours. The moment it feels prescribed, the moment somebody says, this is the wine for your generation, it's dead. What we can do is lower the barriers, make spaces welcoming, remove the judgment, have real people behind counters who don't make you feel stupid for not knowing things, build technology that lets you explore without performing competence. Create wine bars that feel like third places, not temples of expertise, but living rooms where something interesting is always being poured. And then get out of the way. Let them find their thing. Let them reject whatever we love, because they will, and they should. Because that rejection is how they make it theirs. And when they make it theirs, they'll love it with the same intensity that every generation before them has loved whatever they discovered for themselves. But here's what gives me hope. Through all of this, the jug wine, the scored wine, the natural wine, the opt out, there's one thing that's never changed. Not once. Not in any generation. Wine still works best at a table. The styles change, the grapes change, the regions change, the labels, the critics, the trends, the technology. All of it cycles. But the fundamental architecture of wine, that it comes in a bottle designed to be shared, that opening it is an act of invitation, that drinking it slows you down and creates space for conversation. That hasn't moved in thousands of years. My parents' Asti Spumante and my Burgundy and whatever the next generation ends up drinking will probably be completely different. But the thing that wine does, the way it organizes an evening, the way it gives people a reason to sit down and stay, the way it turns a meal into an event and a conversation, into a connection, that's the same. When I sit at a table now and I open a bottle, I'm doing the exact same thing a Roman farmer did 2,000 years ago, and the same thing a monk in Burgundy did in the 12th century, the same thing my father in law did when he pulled a bottle from his own vines and said, "Try this." The wine is different, the ritual is identical. And that's what I think we should be offering. Not the wine, not the style, not the brand or the score, or the label or the trend. The ritual. The experience of sitting down with other people and sharing something that takes a little time, a little attention, a little willingness to be present. That's what every generation ultimately discovers, even if they discover it through completely different wines. The bottle changes, the table doesn't. I think about this a lot. I'm building a wine bar for people who might not think wine is for them. And the temptation is try to convince them to say, no, no, wine is great. Here's why you should love it. Here's the science. Here's the history. Here's the pairing. Look at this score. But I don't think any of that works. I don't think it's ever worked. No generation has been argued into loving wine. What works is a moment, a specific, unrepeatable, personal moment when somebody puts a glass in your hand and something happens. Maybe it's the taste. Maybe it's the setting. Likely, it's the person you're with. Maybe it's all three at once. But something clicks. And suddenly, this thing that felt like it belonged to something else, to your parents, to experts, to another generation, feels like it belongs to you. That moment can't be manufactured. It can't be marketed. It can't be algorithmically delivered. It can be made possible by creating spaces where it's likely to happen, by having real people who care about making you comfortable, by pouring good wine and then shutting up and letting the experience speak for itself. I grew up with Asti Spumante and Bud Light commercials. I found wine through a vineyard in Maryland and a quiet curiosity that took years to become a passion. My kids will find it through something I can't predict, and they should reject whatever I love. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The only thing we owe the next generation is a seat at the table and the freedom to fill their glass with whatever they choose. The rebellion is the tradition.